Good afternoon. It's time for another episode of Odd Man Front, a Sumer Sports podcast. I'm your host, Parker Fleming, and I'm very excited for another guest that I have today to continue in this series of interviews with smart people who are working in and around the world of sports analytics, data, and really excited about this one. Before we get things started, want to make sure you're subscribed to sumersports.com/the zone. We've got all sorts of fun content and articles out there, some great newsletter work, some combination of some graphs and some writing by Sean Syed and by Tej Seth, and then a couple graphs from me in there. Some really great content up on the website. So make sure you're subscribed there, sumersports.com, the zone. And on social media, we just crossed 9,000 followers, which is awesome because we've been building that up. And of course, like it on YouTube, all that fun stuff. Enough with the housekeeping. Let's go ahead, and I'm going to bring on our guest for today. Andrew Patton is the Director of Health and Safety Data Science at the NFL. He joins me today for a conversation that I have been looking forward to since we got it cleared for you to come on the podcast. Andrew, how are you today?
Doing great. Thanks for inviting me. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So I think just getting into it and going ahead, Andrew, the question that I get the most about people who are in sports analytics and working with data around the world of football, right? Your life is objectively cool. You work with data and work for the NFL, right? How did you get into this? Kind of tell me your story, your background, and if you want to work backwards from the NFL and kind of tell us how you got there, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because I think my job is a real one of one. I don't think any other leagues have this job, at least in the United States. And so if there was a pathway, I would be it. But I think it's a culmination of 30 plus years of decisions that were made independent of knowing this job existed. I think the easiest way is to start kind of way back in the beginning. I was a college athlete. I went to Cal, as you can see by my helmet there. I played lacrosse. I played all sorts of sports. I watched too much football growing up as a kid, all that stuff. In college, it was pretty evident I was better at lifting weights than I was at playing the sport. So I got really into strength and conditioning. And I stuck with strength and conditioning coaching for a while, both in college and out of college. I've worked with, the good fortune, worked with all sorts of awesome athletes at Cal, like their incredible, Olympic sports group, which is like some of the best in the world. Worked with lacrosse, basketball, swimming, water polo, every, track and field, pretty much everything except football, actually. And I've worked both in the private space there. And then later in my life, I worked for Loyola in Maryland with a lacrosse team. So I've had a pretty, I would say 10 years of experience doing that, in parallel with all my formal academic and work. And in terms of academics, I was convinced I was going to be like a life scientist. I was an undergraduate degree in toxicology. I worked in scientific consulting for a while, a master's degree in environmental science, and it really ended up getting my PhD in essentially epidemiology and exposure science. And I didn't work at all in sports outside of strength and conditioning until I was 31. So I think it's important for people to, how do you get there, is that, it's not linear at all. My journey in sports started quite literally because I was yelling about Ben Simmons for the Sixers back when he was on the Sixers. And I was in an argument with someone in a mature, reasonable manner. And I essentially pulled out the R console to look something up, and it just pretty much went from there. I've worked at
awesome. I love it. And
stuff in there as well. So,
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you. I think I hit a little lag there and wanted to hop in on the Ben Simmons thing. I love that because that's a good example too of so many people are like, how do I get in sports analytics? I'm like, dude, open up R and start tweeting. Like you can, first step. It's never easier now to get data and to start doing something and to start posting. So yeah, I love that. And I love that kind of unique path. There really is no kind of one way to say, hey, how do I get this job? I just keep doing what I think is right and kind of land here. So tell me about this job. Tell me about your responsibilities as Director of Health and Safety Data Science at the NFL. What does that kind of broadly entail and encompass?
Yeah, so I think one of the, maybe the misconception, because it's, coming off of the title I have, is that I do not sit around all day building models to predict when someone's going to get hurt, right? I think that's an easy, kind of service level interpretation of what this job might do. It's kind of a, like a hacky dad joke here, but I like to put a comma between data and science in my title, because I do science with data. I also work, that's a little silly, but in the sense that a lot of what I do is not building models. It's not evaluating complex things. It's how do we have this ecosystem to have the correct amount of data, the correct amount of understanding of our population, of where they're going, where they're coming from, all the different trends to answer questions before they come up. If we're in a situation where we have to be reactive to every single possible question that comes up, it's a mess. So one of my broad responsibilities, and it's certainly not just me, by the way, there's a large collection of people, both inside the NFL and external to the NFL, including people at BioCore, IQVIA. You might have seen something on CNN recently with BioCore about some of our recent player health and safety investments. So there's a large group of people doing this, and very much is not just me, but it's developing this ecosystem of collecting data, running analytics, systematic reporting on trends, what's going on, and every source of information we can find. So when questions come up, we're able to answer them.
That's really cool. A question I have, I've talked to, a couple folks who work in NFL departments, like for teams specifically. And kind of I've talked to them about the split between how much of your job is, someone says, hey, we need to know these things, go find them. And how much of your job is, hey, let me just kind of explore the data. Let me think about what questions we could ask and answer, and then kind of offer some recommendations based on that. Yeah,
that's a great way to split it, because there, of course, are some times where we get asked, here's this problem or this question, I need an answer by X, Y, and Z. Right? That's a pretty standard workflow of places. But a lot of what I have to do and what we do is try and think about, okay, what's the next question they're going to ask? And how do we anticipate that, both in terms of doing the analytics ahead of time or prepping us for that, or understanding the resource load that might take, or in many cases, do we have the data to be able to answer that? And if not, how do we get that data? So it's a kind of a shell game of figuring out priorities and budgeting. Of course, it's like any other job of how do we apportion resources to answer the questions of the here and now, as well as keeping an eye on the long-term planning of what questions do we see coming down the line. This is both from the fact that, the people who do a lot of this, just like everyone else, we consume a ton of football. So you can see the way things are going in the game. You get questions from teams and just kind of understand where we might be going next. So it's a little bit of both. And certainly it depends greatly on the week. You ask me, some weeks are very much planning. Some weeks and months are, here's a very specific question we want answered. Please answer it.
Interesting. I want to ask about kind of how someone who works in your position kind of watches football on a regular basis, as both, a fan and as someone who potentially has to do that for work. I do want to ask a couple more questions kind of about your role before we get there. I know obviously you guys are working on some things that are behind the scenes and can't necessarily put everything out there on the table. So insofar as we can, I'm really interested in kind of what kind of things you've been working on recently, what kind of questions you're asking about player health, about player safety, and testing hypotheses, and kind of what's been on your mind lately as you approach the game and figure out how do we understand better what's happening with the players on the field as they interact in this system of 22 guys who are at sometimes just slamming into each other head first repeatedly.
Yeah, so I think there are two good examples of that. The first, I will piggyback off some work that was recently presented at Women in Sports Data by one of our data scientists, Ashani Desai. This is about equipment in the NFL. The NFL is unique from many other sports, probably besides hockey, in just the amount of stuff players have to wear or choose to wear on their bodies, and both the complexity of that. For those of us before who don't pay attention to this, or me before I got this job, a helmet's a helmet, shoes are a size and a model, shoulder pads are a shoulder. It seems all homogenous, but in fact, what we do at the NFL is we have RFID tags in every piece of equipment that goes onto a player's body. So we track during games what players are wearing. It's not just, Parker Fleming, who's playing tight end for this team, is wearing this pair of shoes. He's wearing this exact style of shoe and this exact size. And the plate on the bottom of his shoe is this exact model. And also he's wearing this exact style of shoulder pads with 5 or 6 different individual components, and then a helmet with maybe 10 to 17 specific components. So there's a huge amount of information we track on each player in each game for equipment purposes to help us inform safety, performance, everything down the line. And you can imagine when we think of like these exposure scenarios to players, everything is one piece. We're trying to put the pieces together of a puzzle to understand what is happening to players on the field, off the field for this stuff. So the equipment track is, I think, really interesting and a good example of the confluence of hard in-person work for our equipment managers who do a really awesome job of outfitting our teams to be ready to play safely, as well as collecting data for us to run analytics on, because it's a very big time commitment for them, combined with, a pretty advanced tech stack to make all this run with no latency and passive RFID tags. And if you spend a lot of time in the sciences, whether it's big research institutions, that's the kind of stuff you end up doing. It's like lab science. Your lab is, in this case, a locker room in a football stadium where you tinker with mechanical stuff, check the data, then go back to your computer to run analysis. And for many of us, like that's science. To me, that is data, science, where we're collecting data and doing science on it, as opposed to, the canonical, stuffing models into a box to get predictions. So that's a good example of one. Another one recently that's a little more maybe potentially spicier and interesting is the quarterback sneaks. Last year, you can remember there was quite a bit of an uproar in the media and sports media about sneaks, and particularly the Eagles. And so we do an investigation when there's a substantial rule change. We do investigations, and I particularly was the one leading the charge on the sneaks. And we evaluated sneaks in a whole bunch of different variety of contexts. So I've seen every quarterback sneak in the NFL in the last 5 years. We've had a great team of reviewers, and particularly called them out by name, Juliana Bushnell at Emory and Ananya Singh, who's at Emory as well, in terms of just doing awesome work for us on that front. And so we have to understand this from a football perspective. Like, what is the team trying to accomplish? What are the levers we could pull on this play to make it different? Or is there a need to make it different? And as you could see in the committee meeting last year, there was no rule change passed. And part of that was because of the information we found. Well, I can't release all the specifics. Just like the kickoff rule this year changed the touchback. We had to evaluate what are the possible outcomes of this change. Because it's very easy just to throw a rule out there, but how do we anticipate teams are going to change their strategies? What are the obvious, things? What are the knock-on effects? You never want to roll something back because you didn't spend enough time investigating the possible use cases. So that's kind of the intersection of how we work directly with the football strategy.
Interesting. Yeah, I think specifically about something like the kickoffs, and you said something that's so important there, of kind of you're almost forecasting behavior a little bit in terms of, if we change this, what do we expect? So I presume that in addition to kind of that speculative work that you have of, hey, what would it look like if we did X? What would it look like if we did this? Or the quarterback sneak, the tush push, if you will. How does that actually, what is that actual effect there? How much are you doing kind of in-season tracking as well with the kickoffs and noticing, hey, they're not returning it as much. Hey, there are fewer of those kind of big hits on those plays. And hey, average field position isn't necessarily suffering.
Yeah, so and this ties into kind of my background in public health, is that when we do what's called surveillance, and that's a formal term in epidemiology, the two words we like are routine and systematic. And, professors everywhere are high-fiving that I remembered those two words from lectures, but that's the idea of how we track data. It's not I wonder what happened this week. It's that ahead of time, we spend a lot of effort and time setting up our systems. So we have automated reports that come in. So it's not a question of, what do I look at this week? It's we decide ahead of time, how do we evaluate if this rule change was good, bad, indifferent, or whatever. And if you fit your things you want to measure after the fact, you're no longer actually doing a good job. You have to decide ahead of time, how are we going to evaluate and success or failure isn't really the paradigm here, but how are we going to evaluate what the effects of this program change are? And you have to plan that ahead of time, set your tech stuff in place, and then you just sit back and watch. So we are currently surveilling all sorts of things, which sounds diabolical, but we just, we set up code and programs and automation so the information we care about is delivered to us in ways that we can digest.
Very, very cool. I'm also hearing a little bit, again, I'm just fascinated by the question of, people saying, how do I get into this? What kind of skills do I need to develop to succeed at sports science? So I'm hearing you say a lot of kind of data wrangling and more of the technical stack side of things, not just, hey, let me play with the data that we have is clean, but then also doing that surveillance and presumably reporting that. And so I'll tee that up with a question as well and say, how often are you reporting internally to the NFL? Is your department or that you work with, are you communicating with teams about maybe things they're looking at, about, fielding requests for looking into things as well league wide? How does that relationship kind of work when you have these data and these, the surveillance and these reports? How are you communicating those?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's a little bit of inside baseball here, which is actually good, I think, in that we do not obviously work for the teams. Like, I am not a consultant of a team. Say, hey, here's a question I have, go find it out. We need to make sure any change or question that we answer can be to all 32. So it's not, we do not act as a third-party research arm for a team to commission a project, for example. Right. But obviously teams have questions. They can ask us. We can follow up. We can provide them guidance on certain bits. But generally, our guidance goes to all 32. And on the reporting side, you can imagine, depending on where you are in the NFL, there's a pretty overwhelming amount of information that could be directed to you at any one given time. So what we need to do, one of the hard parts of surveillance and reporting is what is enough and what is too much, and then who needs to know what and when. And so it's always a question of leading or lagging indicators. And so we often have weekly meetings and cadences that are on the books ahead of time where we report broadly on our findings, and if there are any kind of blips in any of our surveillance that is unexpected or along that lines. But yeah, with the tech skills, our department is pretty big. The pod of people I work with most closely is probably about 10 people, 2 or 3 engineers, a couple data scientists, and then some project managers. And yeah, it's a broad set of skills. Some of us run much more on the junior side. Some of us are on, the mid-career side. Mike Lopez is part of our group. He leads our group, and he's, he is who he is. You don't really introduce him all that much, but he's a real statistician. I am not a statistician at all, but I have, doing deep research experience and also more of a production data science background. So we have a lot of kind of interleaving skill sets that allow us to do a lot of this cross-functional work that isn't just let's build a model constantly.
Cool. Makes sense. And I'm sure the kind of having the minds that are all coming at the same problem from different perspectives gives you a lot of breadth there. Yeah. Okay, let's return to that. Let's return to that question. You work for the NFL. You have a vested stake in kind of the entire league. How do you watch a game on Sunday? What happens there? Are you rooting? Are you watching it, taking notes for work? What does that kind of look like normally?
So like most of us, I'll have Red Zone up on one screen, and then I'll have a game I find interesting or want to watch for mostly personal fandom or fun reasons on my laptop or something like that. I don't need to watch games like a team employee watches games. It doesn't matter to me if they run, out of 12 personnel, they run this play more often than that play. But it is relevant for me in many ways, like a national football writer might for The Athletic or ESPN or something, like be aware of the large and kind of sticky trends in the league, both week to week and season to season. So, going back to the personnel thing, the shocking increase in 11 personnel from like 40% to 65% of the time over the last, dozen years or so, that's interesting to me. But the specific play calls and the specific teams that may run that and their person, that is less irrelevant to me. But I want to know how the league is going about it, not how each individual team and their success or failure bits and pieces. So yeah, so I'll have Red Zone up for sure. I'll have 1 or 2 games on my laptop, and then I consume a lot of podcasts and a lot of written material because, for people who do have to keep track of a lot of things, it's very difficult to keep your finger on the pulse of everything all at once. So having other people summarize it to you while you're running errands or just, doing other things is pretty helpful. And I will say, I get a lot of good ideas from either people in the media or the kind of like, wouldn't that be cool if? I'm luckily in a position I can do that often. So I will get good ideas from people in kind of funky places.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I think that's, you do kind of get those perspectives because it does matter, like the product on the field, it does matter what people think of it to some extent. And so kind of exploring those different avenues and different perceptions is really good. Great. So in kind of your day-to-day, you're doing this surveillance and you're watching things, you have almost that pre-registration of here's exactly what we're looking for. You're also innovating and ideating. What are some kind of things you're looking at in the future of, hey, want to sort of investigate how this trend is going to impact the game long-term? What are some of those bigger picture macro trends that you have an eye on right now?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting ones that's always the game of offense, defense, cat and mouse. For a couple of years there, offenses were just flame throwing people, right? And then they changed defensive ideas a bit, make you dink and dunk, slowed down a bit. And now we're kind of in a intermediary transitionary part as teams are are, and this is part of the competition, right? This is why we like sports, that they are trying to figure out how to break through in a variety of directions. So that's both as a fan, I think that's cool of the chess match, and also from a league perspective, understanding what the effect is for games, what the effect is for personnel, kind of what the effect is for strategy long term, and that ties into the fact that you see now coming into the league, all of our quarterbacks are really good athletes. They didn't used to be that way, and so that strategic innovation of, we have these guys with skill sets we didn't have 15 years ago. So how do metrics and decisions we make based on information from 10, 15 years ago matter now, when Anthony Richardson could probably start at 10 different positions for the Colts if he wanted to. There's so that kind of personnel change, both in who the people are and in how they're being used, I think is really fascinating. And it's nice because that's what team employees think about. We're thinking about the same problems, just a slightly different question and answer paradigm.
Right. Makes a lot of sense. And you've heard I've seen people kind of on Twitter and heard a couple of people on podcasts talking about the, too high, almost like it's the shift in baseball or something that's, hey, this is so dramatically, hard for offenses. How do we maybe break this up and flip things around? But I do kind of like that idea of kind of the swinging pendulum, the cat and mouse of offense and defense, because it is important to recognize that a lot of this is not a stable equilibrium. The game is not going to be the same next week.
Safeties were not invented in 2019.
Yep, exactly. And even with the quarterback sneak, for instance, we've seen success rates on the sneak are down a little bit. There's certain quarterbacks who have clearly communicated, hey, I don't know if this is what I want to be doing. And so teams are changing their behavior. Defenses are changing their behavior to account for it. And that evolution is really, really fun to watch as well.
I suggest people go look at Tom Brady's 2012 season for a quarterback who's pretty good at sneaking. If they want, we can go back that far in our data collection, but it's cyclical. All these things are cyclical and they come around. And I think that's part of why football is so awesome, is that you can see these things that were formations that were used in 1930 or, pulled out in college again. They pulled it back in the NFL. So there's a lot of, again, the cyclical nature of trying to break what the other team's trying to do is, that's from a competition perspective, super, super interesting.
Right. Cool. The other thing that I did want to ask you about was, you mentioned equipment work earlier and talking about, tracking and kind of getting a sense of just what's happening. Are you working on, responsible for, in and around the world of, altering equipment for safety, or perhaps examining practices or how different teams are treating equipment to, minimize injury during the week, or potentially minimize injury in a game?
Yeah, so some of that is team specific. They would consider that to be a competition secret. The things I can talk about that are interesting are, for example, the helmet companies that are making position specific helmets are pretty cool. That attempt to reduce the impacts that those players receive. And then again, like Guardian caps are a program we help administer. Those are the foam caps that players wear on top of their helmets. And so we've kind of, over the last 2 years, myself, a couple others at the NFL, and then obviously our engineering partners at BioCore and the NFLPA have helped with, getting those out, understanding those, getting those in place. And so it's, again, the reminder that this is very, very much not a me thing. It is a we thing. A lot of smart people to kind of push this forward, because it definitely takes a lot of resource and a lot of people to get this done. But I think those are pretty interesting. The idea of custom individual cleats per player. So not you buy a shoe off the rack and throw an insert in, but you get your foot scanned and you have a custom shoe made for you that fits your foot perfectly, is a pretty cool example of something that we're working towards.
Interesting. Is that the weirdest thing that you guys are thinking about? Custom shoes? I think that's kind of the off the wall, maybe the one that people wouldn't think about. NFL is looking at how exactly the fit of the shoes to that. Is there anything else kind of along those lines that maybe the casual fan wouldn't think that's being considered on the field?
I think that's the most interesting one I can talk about.
Yeah, that's great. No, I love it. I love a little mystery there too. That's great.
And because players wear different cleats for different conditions, right? If you're playing in a monsoon or you're playing on a beautiful 75 and sunny day, you might wear different shoes. So the ability to kind of build these one-offs for players is pretty cool, both technologically and just from a comfort and fit perspective.
Yeah, fascinating, and obviously potentially gains there in longevity if the shoes are better. Guys, cumulative effect as well. So cool that there is immediate and potential long term effects there. How do you feel, Andrew, that the existence of your job, of your department, the fact that you are making real contributions that do affect the product on the league year in, year out, speaks to the acceptance of data and analytics in the NFL? I know in the public eye, it's, film versus stats and it's contentious and all of that. But clearly the NFL from a broad perspective and from a team specific perspective is very interested in data and how can we find an edge through systematic analysis of the scenarios here.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always been a person that I think the word analytics kind of obscures what we're doing, even though my division is data and analytics. Again, my job isn't to say you need to run this route combination because you'll get more EPA than if you do it under center versus shotgun. That's cool. Not what I do and not what the end of the league does. So if you change it from analytics to making good decisions based on information gathered through research, we do that all over the place, whether it's in broadcast and media, finance. I mean, finance, invented the spreadsheet, right? So they've been doing that forever. Media, operations, all sorts of stuff. So yeah, there's a very big push at the league to become a leader in all aspects of the data and not just limit our analytical space to how does team A beat team B. It's how do we, again, create this entity that can answer a lot of really complicated questions before they come up and anticipate what's coming next. It's a little bit of a kind of a cop-out vague answer, but it's true that there's a very big investment at the league to kind of understand what the product and how we impact it.
Makes a ton of sense. One more question I had, and then I want to talk to you a little bit about Big Data Bowl because that is very exciting. One thing, another thing I think about, we're recording this on a Thursday. There's a Thursday night game here. How much are you looking into rest differentials and even the problem of scheduling as a player health and safety kind of issue of scheduling? Hey, are the balance of travel days and rest days equally distributed? Are there asymmetries because teams are differently located across the United States and within their divisions?
Yeah, scheduling is for anybody who wants to start thinking about complicated problems. I recommend starting with scheduling. Pick a sport. It doesn't really matter. Figuring out, baseball, basketball, hockey, football, whatever. Trying to think about the logistics, the scheduling, the equity of having all these people travel all across the country. Oh, also, in all these facilities have Rihanna concerts and, bad weather and all these things that
and let's go to London twice a year.
Yeah,
let's just make it more complicated.
It's an incredibly complicated question and again, you're trying to optimize on like 10 different axes all at once. So it's a question that we spend a ton of time thinking about, both in terms of resources and how do we do a good job at this. But there's always going to be a situation where, there are logistics at play here that are beyond there's only so many days in a week. There's only so many days you can put on TV. So the scheduling is it's a massive optimization problem on a whole bunch of different factors, and it's really complicated. And while we do some work there, inequity, health and safety is taken into consideration. Certainly, we don't have teams playing every game back. You don't play an NBA schedule, right? I mean, it's to be somewhat simple there, but yeah, definitely take into account.
Andrew, tell me about another thing that you get to be a part of and that anyone could be a part of that's very fun. Big Data Bowl, something that is put on. Obviously, Michael Lopez has done a ton of work there to make that great, and it's been a good event. I believe we're coming up on the fifth year of that.
I think.
5th year of that. Yeah. So tell me kind of where did that come from? How are you involved in it? And kind of what role does it serve for the NFL and for people who want to work in the NFL?
Yeah. So I'll say it's Michael Lopez's baby. Like he did it. It's his. He's the reason it exists, and he's the reason that it's so awesome. I help out. If you are unfamiliar with the Big Data Bowl, it is a open data science competition where the NFL provides data that you can't get anywhere else, and a prompt on the website Kaggle, Kaggle, and then it is up to you to use the data to answer the question or the prompt in the way that you see fit. Anybody can answer. It's free to enter. There's some requirements on the page to win prizes, but essentially it's one of the biggest data science competitions there is. And the best part is the people who do well And again, you do not need to win. I'm saying the people who do well and put out good work have extremely good track records of getting hired by teams, either in the NFL or elsewhere. If you are somebody sitting at home who says, how do I get into sports analytics? The Big Data Bowl is your answer. Even if you don't win, even if you don't submit, learning to practice with the data, get your feet wet with tracking data, which again, I cannot emphasize, you cannot get anywhere else unless you have quite a bit of money. Play around with it, learn, try and build a prompt. Maybe it's your first ever coding project. Make some charts, make some tables. You don't need to win for this to be a valuable learning experience or professional development experience. Winning is great, and that would be awesome. And the winners do go on to do great things, but it is not a competition you have to win to get value out of, both personally and professionally.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of colleagues at Sumer have done it and placed well. A couple of people I know have just played with the data and honed their skills. Again, I really didn't know much about tracking data until I guess it was 2020 was the year that there was some fun coverage data, and I was playing around with it. And it's a really cool initiative. So there is a mentorship program happening with the Big Data Bowl. People can apply to be mentors, and that's going to be announced soon, I believe.
So we've selected our mentees and mentors. Those matches are being announced shortly. Next year, if you miss this cycle, I strongly recommend applying for this program. We match you one-on-one with a team staffer or a member of the NFL who works in analytics, so someone like myself. And then we guide you through a Big Data Bowl submission. The expectation is that you are somebody who's quantitatively skilled enough to work with the data, understand a little bit of football, but maybe not at the level that certainly a team staffer does, or maybe someone like myself or another NFL employee. And we help you with the Big Data Bowl process. We have some career development panels, networking. It's an awesome program. Kind of the sweet spot is people just exiting grad school or just exiting undergrad, so they could theoretically jump into sports. But we take people from all backgrounds, all skill levels, and kind of match you with people that help you learn and grow. And again, it's a fantastic program. I'll put it on our team at the NFL of 6 people, one of whom has placed in the Big Data Bowl, and one of them was a Big Data Bowl mentee at some point. So we hire people. So, we put our money where our mouth is. We hired people directly from that. Teams hired people directly from it. So it's a fantastic program. And again, a testament to teams volunteering their time during this season to help young people learn how to get into sports analytics. So a huge, huge shout out to our mentors at teams and, some data companies that truly donate their time and money to help this.
Yeah, very, very cool. And then again, for everyone listening can look that up, but the timeline is coming out. The mentees will be announced.
Yeah, mentees will be announced here shortly, and then the Big Data Bowl itself will be opened up in early October. Awesome. Very, very
cool. Yeah, a lot of fun. I'm excited to see what the question is and to play around with the data myself. So will be a lot of fun to see. Andrew, while we've got a couple minutes here, kind of after we've covered all the things we talked about beforehand, would love to ask, what have you kind of enjoyed watching in the NFL this year? It's a little bit current events here, but what are some storylines, maybe some players that you've said, hey, this was just fun. We're here as a fan, not in any capacity as working for the NFL, but just watching football and knowing football.
Micah Parsons.
Dude, he's so good.
He's really good. Like, I'm an Eagles fan, so it pains me to say it, but he's awesome. Really, really good. Watching the Dolphins offense has been cool as well. It looks like something out of a video game that I haven't played before. It's super interesting. And that's part of the cat and mouse game. Like you saw last year, where the Chargers had this awesome defensive game plan against the Dolphins and totally shut them down. Then this year, just McDaniel just blows them out of the water with stuff I've certainly never seen before. Not that means much, but those have been really fun and interesting. The Niners continuing to just be really good at everything. The Cowboys defense has been so much fun to watch this year thus far. And the Dolphins offense have been kind of the two things I've been enjoying the most. Certainly.
Yeah, I think. Absolutely. And it is fun to see a guy like Parsons, who we've said, a lot of people have said, maybe one of the best players in the NFL, and see him kind of back that up absolutely overall. And the same thing, seeing Tua just kind of come into his own after, quarterback development is so hard. And I think Miami and San Francisco are both kind of interesting in terms of quarterback development, because you get a guy like Tua who it's finally clicking, they're running that offense and it looks so good. Or San Francisco, where they say, hey, this guy had the raw skills, maybe didn't necessarily look the part coming out of college, and we were able to identify that and develop and build a system around him where we can move forward. It just raises so many questions about what does the draft even mean anymore? If we can do this kind of analysis and get a starting quarterback there out of the 7th round.
And the new Lamar offense has been fun as well.
Yeah, very, very fun as well. And again, another guy, kind of quarterback development, breaking the mold, one of those athletic guys that could play a lot of positions, and how they choose to use him is as interesting as, kind of the efficiency of whether it works or not. Like, what are they even trying to do with him is a lot of fun to watch. Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, Andrew, I really appreciate you coming on and talking. The work you're doing, it just sounds so interesting. There's a million more questions I could ask, and probably, 60% of those you tell me you can't tell me the answer to those, but I respect that and really appreciate your time here and the stuff you're doing for the league. I think that's cool and that's interesting. You do have a blog up over on the NFL football operations site. Yes. That is, I found it by Googling Extra Point Blog NFL. And I think it'll take you there. And that's some cool place where you and Mike Lopez and a couple of people have documented some of the things maybe you're looking at, some personnel changes, and some good work about luck and versatility. Where can people find you on Twitter as well, right?
It's ANPATT7. Usually it's bad Philadelphia 76ers takes. But I will often be, I got into the NFL through the NBA. So a lot of my work, my public work where I can not worry about what I have to talk about is on basketball. But I'm available there on Twitter. I'm generally available. If you have a question, feel free to reach out. I can't always say I'll respond in a way that you'd like necessarily, but I'll do my best to get it to you. And then, I'm around at conferences in the fall as well. If you see me, feel free to, come up and say hi. I'm pretty approachable. And then I'll add this because you mentioned at this top, people often ask me, how do you get started? Just start. Just start. I mean, there's really no way to it. There's no, you're the lucky few who magically gets into something. Just start. You got to be bad before you're good. And sometimes got to be bad for a while. So it's totally normal and fine, and just get after it. And, there's no one path to get here, and certainly wasn't one path for me. I'm sure you're no one path for you. So glad to be here, Parker. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. This has been Odd Man Front, a Sumer Sports podcast. Make sure you're liked and subscribed to the YouTube. On that channel, you can get Eric Eager and Thomas Dimitrov on Monday, Wednesday. You get Tej, Seth, and Sean Syed doing some stats and some scheme on Tuesdays, and Odd Man Front here on Thursdays. Thanks for listening. We'll catch all of you next time.